So thank you all for being here. We're going to do our best on this, on the whole voice volume thing here. Okay, today we are hoping that by the end of the day, we have general agreement on what a model framework would look like for our new assessment and accountability system. So that's what we are striving for today. We will have Dr. Fletcher joining us on camera around 10:30. So we are going to go through federal accountability and reporting today, same format that we did yesterday. So we'll have a lot of table talk, and then Dr. Jim Flynn is going to come up and kind of summarize things for us. Hopefully we will have Dr. Fletcher on the call with us at that time, and then he'll share his final thoughts, and we'll have a wrap up. So we should be done by noon. We will still have lunches here. You're welcome to stay and continue to talk and network if you would like at the end of the day, or you can also take a box lunch and go if you need to be somewhere. All right, Penny's going to go through the agenda I guess I just went through the agenda, didn't I? Sorry. Okay. All right, so we will go ahead and jump into federal accountability. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
You gotta talk up.
Oh, okay. I got to talk up. Okay. Good morning. I hope you can hear me. I generally have a softer voice, so but I'll use my teacher voice where I've been in the classroom several years ago, but still glad for you to be back and continue the great conversation that we had yesterday. So we got a lot of good discussion, a lot of good feedback yesterday, and we're feeling confident in the direction that we're going. We got some reasonable direction yesterday that we're going to be able to move forward with. And so we're looking forward to today and making that same good progress in the federal as well as the state, as well as the reporting. So we've got, yesterday we had really good support on a local accountability system. I believe that that is a direction that we will see in the next step. So looking at local accountability, then reducing the state to, no, yesterday we talked about the assessment next, looking at a through course model, and whether that is a vendor produced or a state produced, that is yet to be determined. I think that's the part of the next iteration of discussion. So we're looking, as Karen said, for this general direction. We're not looking at the details. We're looking forward to then the next step. After today, we're going to come back to you to bring a framework for discussion. And then if we get that in November, then what we'll do is we'll continue to work toward those finer details. So again, we're looking for general direction for a framework that we'll bring back to you so that we can discuss that and have some direction that we can take and discuss with the Kentucky Board of Education. So that's kind of the direction we're going. That's the goal for today. We got that good discussion yesterday as a direction moving forward. As assessment, and then for the state, we talked several pieces yesterday moving forward with a flight plan. Today, we're going to talk about federal, and then we're going to talk about reporting. So those two pieces are link together with the federal as well as the reporting. So we want to talk first about what is not only in the 4.0, but we want to talk through some requirements of ESSA. So we've talked about minimizing this footprint with the federal program in the federal accountability, limiting the impact on the field. So what we're looking for is to make space, reducing that federal footprint and making space for the local accountability so that it's minimized impact on the field, so that efforts can be focused on what that context is that we talked about yesterday that's so important, getting our community members and our communities and our stakeholders looking at the pieces that is important to them, is relevant to our stakeholders in our communities. Limiting what we have to do to meet that federal requirement. So we know that we have to identify for federal purposes CSI, Comprehensive Support and Improvement, ATSI, Additional Targeted Support and Improvement, and TSI, Targeted Support and Improvement. Those are the three. Now we've talked about another category that could be possibly called meets requirements. But if that's not a direction that we want to go, we could limit that to just those three categories and leaving the other ones either unidentified or some other designation. Okay, so I think that's a really important point for us to determine today and get that, again, that general direction, because that's then going to be reporting as well. So we've got this interplay with all of these different pieces. So we're talking about them individually, but they work together to make the complete system. Okay, so with the federal piece, I want to talk about, there's 4 categories that are required in ESSA. Okay, there's 4 categories. The first one is academic results, and that is reading and math. Okay, that's the first one. Let's talk about elementary and middle school. So there's 4 categories that must be reported for a federal identification of those 3 categories. Assessment results, reading and math. The second one is another academic indicator. Now, we said yesterday that we have really good agreement on individual student growth. That's what that could be. Okay. The third one is an EL progress, English learner progress. That's the acquisition of English language proficiency for our English learners. Okay, that's the third category. The fourth category at the elementary and middle school is a school quality student success indicator. Okay, so those are the 4. That school quality student success indicator right now is a school quality and climate survey. Abby's going to come up and she's going to talk to you about some data that we have around that survey. Okay, so those are the 4 at the elementary and middle school. There's 4 categories for identification that has to be used for identification of CSI, TSI, and ATSI. Let's talk about the high school level now. Again, 4 categories, but they're just a slightly bit different. The first one's very similar, reading and math. That has to be the majority piece of your system. The other one, EL progress indicator. Again, we utilize that in the state for ours. We have the access test. We utilize the access test. We give that from grades K through 12. We utilize that for accountability only 3 through high school. And then, so reading and math, EL progress. Then again, that school quality student success indicator, that's the third one. Again, we can talk about whether that's a survey or not. And then the fourth one is our graduation rate. Right now, the graduation rate, we value the work that our schools and our students and our communities, our parents work toward that graduation for 4-year, and we include the 5th year average graduation rate. So that's in Kentucky, we go ahead for our accountability, we utilize that 5th year. Okay, so that's the 4 at high school. So elementary middle has the individual student growth, and that at high school, it has the graduation rate. Now, we've said that we want to limit the impact and reduce it to only what's required federally. So notice I just said 4 at the high school level, and I want to stay there just for a moment. So the 4 could be reading and math, EL progress, school quality student success indicator, and that graduation rate. What's missing? What we have in our current system? Post-secondary readiness. So now I just want to be transparent in the fact that if we say we're just going to go with the minimum required, that transition readiness at high school could be that school quality student success indicator and not the survey. That's an option. But our survey, you're going to look and you're going to see, and Abby's going to tell you about how people have said they value that student voice in the accountability system. Okay, that's a decision point and a discussion that we want you to have today. Okay, so just want you to think about the fact that at high school could be 4, or could be 5. But it's not the bare minimum at high school if we decide to go with 5, okay? And so, yes, Jim. That's a good question, and I'm glad that you asked it, because Ray and Gretchen are talking about that right now, about science. So you're not missing it in accountability, though. ASSA, or the U.S. Department, says you have to test science. You don't have to have it, because we're talking about accountability, you don't have to hold it accountable. That's great. Another point of discussion, okay? Another point of discussion. So we've got a lot in this federal piece. When we just say we're going to minimize or limit the impact and take it down to that minimum federal requirement, that's a lot of decision points that we can discuss. That science discussion is very similar to this discussion we had yesterday in state accountability around social studies and writing. Okay? All right. The other piece, again, for this federal, I think that we've got really good agreement, and you tell me if you're not hearing this agreement, that we want to do away with the color rating. Again, that's within the state, but that would impact then the reporting piece. And we'll talk about that just a little bit more. So again, the flight path that we could get to this reduced federal footprint is we could reduce and simplify the federal. We could identify only those three, and leave the others either undesignated or something like meets requirements, and utilize the reporting for what needs to be reported. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, let me pause there for questions to see if you have any questions or clarifying to get you into the discussion. And Abby's going to bring us some data, but is there any kind of clarifying questions? Because that was a really good one about science.
Can you make, just for for me, maybe there's other things about this, but the survey versus post-secondary readiness, Can you tell me that definition to meet the federal, what are our options again? Did you say something about that could count for that?
Yeah, yes. So that it has to be a school quality student success measure. So that's like the broad category. So states do different things. States do, we in Kentucky have utilized a couple of things in that category. Right now we've got in that category at high school, we've got the survey and we've got post-secondary readiness because we've got the two. We also have that change element in that category. So the change on the indicators, because change is not an academic component, it's not the status. So the department will not allow us to put the change component in that academic piece, for reading and math. So we have that change component that is in that category as well, both at elementary, middle, and high. Other states have utilized chronic absenteeism. They've utilized the attendance. There's other categories that we could pursue. Now Kentucky, we since 2010 have utilized the either post-secondary readiness, transition readiness, what we've called it multiple things over the years, but we value greatly that readiness for that next step into that. So, but the survey came out of that exclusive list of indicators that is written into statute that came out of Senate Bill 158 in 2020. That was part of that exclusive list that was mandated by our state. Was that so? When we talked to the drafters of the bill, they said that their expectation was a survey. So that's how we ended up with the survey, is because it came out of that legislation in 2020.
So the Fed gives you flexibility about how you define that school quality, student success indicator, but our state statute defines it with the survey and post-secondary readiness, or
yes. Yes. So for those of you that didn't hear that, Jim's observation is correct, that the feds provide flexibility on how you define it, or how do you meet that expectation or that requirement. But our state statute, in that exclusive list in statute, list the survey as well as post-secondary.
Everybody in the room, can you talk a little bit about different ways that currently we have in place, how we define post-secondary readiness and some of the measures we use now?
Sure. So the question is about, the question is about how we meet post-secondary readiness right now. And so I'll attempt it, and I'll look to my colleagues and friends here in OAA for if I get all the details around it. So we have two different ways. We have academic as well as career readiness. So there's, if you will, a menu of options within post-secondary readiness now that our schools and our districts, they determine what their students need, and then provide them the supports to demonstrate readiness for that next step, whether it is readiness for post-secondary academia or whether it's for careers or both. So for the academic piece, we have, there's multiple ways you can meet the academic readiness, starting with the ACT. We also have dual credit within our academics. We have the AP exams, advanced placement. We have the Cambridge International, and as well as the International Baccalaureate. For the careers, we have very similar. We have the post-secondary dual credit for the career piece. We have the workplace readiness. We have apprenticeships. Anything else I'm missing on the career? On the career in industry certifications thing. Industry certifications, yes. That used to be COSA, that's right. Like, end of the program things. Yeah, yes, good. So we have a variety of already some local decision making within our accountability system. Good. Thank you for that clarifying question. Any other questions I can help with? Okay, so a lot to unpack there within this federal piece. So we're going to look at some data, and I'm going to turn it over to Abby with some good responses.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So you've seen this before. When we administered our prototype survey, we had about 650 respondents from a wide variety of respondents groups. The federal accountability section of the survey was a little bit shorter, so we'll go a little bit faster because I know there's a lot to discuss this morning. So firstly, we ask, should we advocate to report only the minimum number of federal school classification labels? And then we asked everyone to opine individually on what those labels should be. Should we support a targeted or additional support and improvement? 84% of respondents said yes, we should. Should we report a comprehensive support and improvement label? Again, 86% says yes, we should report that label. And then should we report one other classification? In other words, either meets requirements or another classification from our selection of options. 73% support yes, including that. We also asked, since we've already discussed that there is widespread support for removing the color label system, we asked, what impact do you think would the removal of the color rating system have on schools serving high populations of marginalized students? Now, we had a lot of different sort of varieties of responses on this question. 123 of our respondents felt that removing the color label system would have a positive impact. They cited things like removing the color labels would reduce bias and stigma in the current system. They felt like a new system would more accurately measure performance of schools and students. And people did bring up that the color system has negative connotations for some students and teachers. 39 respondents said that felt that removing the color system would have no impact on populations of marginalized students. And then 61 respondents felt that the removing the rating might have a negative impact. They cited the current system's easy to understand for lay people. They felt like they liked the current system. There were also some concerns expressed that a new system might let some districts or students slip through the cracks. And also they pointed out that there can be a benefit in needing some form or competition or incentive for schools, in between schools and districts. We've also pointed this out before. It didn't necessarily address this question, but many respondents in their respondents pointed out that they support a desire for a system that measures individual student growth, which I know we've discussed before today. And then also 57 of our respondents didn't necessarily opine on whether or not there would be an impact on marginalized students in removing the color system. They just felt like they had an opportunity and they wanted to point out their critiques in the color rating system. All of these responses are summed up in your yellow packets. Again, we try to include a wide variety of responses so that you get a full picture of all the types of responses that we got. And then lastly, 61% of our respondents are in favor of keeping the school climate and safety information in our accountability system. You can see we have support from a large variety of our respondents groups, including community members, family members, and education professionals, district administrators, DACs, teachers, education cooperative staff. So broad support for keeping school safety and climate information. All right, and I will turn that back over to Sarah.
So just to reorient us, yesterday, we also mentioned the data that was collected through our 36 districts. Again, those 18 L3s, but also 18 other non-L3 districts in comparison. And so bringing them together for that 90-minute focus group session. Again, we had it was actually close to 200 individuals who joined from all 36 districts, representing the stakeholder groups you see here. And I'll just pull up an example here in just a moment, specifically from parents and community members. But on page 5 of your yellow packet, you have these key themes. Again, these are intended to be those cross-cutting trends from all stakeholder groups. We saw general interest in reducing complexity of the system. And so moving away from color ratings to something more simple, simplified to those federally minimum requirements, but also wanting to keep an eye on the way that that element of accountability drives us towards continuous improvement. So wanting to stay true to that. Also looking, again, the growth model was favored here as well. And then just putting an emphasis on the public perception, wanting many of our stakeholders expressed ways to look for areas of celebration within that federal system as well. And looking at the ways that the color system currently misrepresents some of our school quality in a lot of ways. And so if you turn just as an example to page 8, of your yellow packet as well. That's just one, a deep dive into parents and community perspective in particular. When asked a question about our federal accountability in 4.0, you'll see a trend summary there towards the top that kind of just captures for you trends across the data and what we heard from that group in particular. So you can see parents and community members in general supported simplifying federal accountability system to those 3 categories. In particular, parents and community members felt it was important to simplify for better understanding. I personally was with our district assessment coordinators, heard that as well in that group, thinking, you know, we live that day in and day out, and it's complicated for us. And so we heard in other groups as well, how do we simplify this for better understanding to the public as well? And then parents and community members as well in general expressed some concerns about how this system could potentially impact our diverse learners, such as our multilingual learners, our special education students, and wanted to caution some of those post-graduation outcomes, really leaning into those factors beyond the school's control and how holding schools accountable to more of those societal impacts may be negatively impacting schools in a way that is beyond their control. And so that's just an example of some of the trends that we heard out of that parent community group in particular, but feel free to look through that data to those other stakeholder groups as well. All right, I believe we're going to take some time to dive into some discussion.
Okay, so we're looking again today for that general direction. So we want you during this table time to discuss with those that are at your table the data, looking at the data. What are your reactions to the data? What would you see as a path to move forward with? Okay, again, we're looking for that general direction because we're trying to hone in on a framework for this federal accountability piece. So let's take about 40 minutes on this one. So until, what time is it? 40, until 10 o'clock. Until 10 o'clock. So to discuss. Yeah, sorry.
For table talk?
For table talk.
Why don't we go until quarter till or 20 till?
Okay.
Remember that's slow.
Oh, is that slow? Okay. So let's go until about 9:45, 9:50. Okay. All right. All right.
the overview, there were 2 really specific questions that she wanted to get some feedback on. So I think we'll start there, but I want to make sure we have space to also bring in some of the other richness that I heard across the tables as well. So know that we will get to that here in this share out. So the first one that Jennifer brought up, remember she was sort of walking us through the types of indicators that the federal government requires for elementary and middle schools and for high schools. And if we want to get back to the bare minimum, by including the school quality and the school climate survey, we wouldn't quite be at the bare minimum. And so that's something that in the survey data, over 60% of participants were saying that they really felt like that was valuable. And I'm curious who might be willing to share from your tables how you thought about that particular question that Jennifer posed. Did anyone talk about the school quality? Oh, here we go. Perfect. Trevor.
Sorry. I went up to grab coffee and I was like, oh, wait, we did talk about this. So we kind of, the way we looked at it is like, why not? You know, we think, but that does go to us. It seems like it kind of goes beyond what the federal requirements are saying. But that information is used for federal accountability. So I think it's a good thing. So that's what we kind of talked about.
Great. Oh, yep. Chair Tipton.
Thank you. I was quiet yesterday, so I'll talk a little today. I have to leave early again today for committee meetings, so I apologize ahead of time. One of the things that I noticed about the survey is who completed the survey. There were 9 business industry representatives, 24 community members, 18 parents. If you look under other, there was 1 student. And I think this, it's not a negative impact, but this survey is educator heavy. If you're going to succeed at convincing the state and convincing the General Assembly, I think it's important to get a more broader perspective from across the state from these stakeholder groups. And I'll make another comment while I've got the mic. I was asked a question, what would be the challenges to getting this through the legislature? And it's going to take education, because you got a lot of legislators, they haven't been to the KUWL Council meetings. They're just not familiar. They're probably not familiar with the current accountability system. So it's going to take a huge effort on the part of everybody in the community to go out and spend time individually and explain to this. And I think the point was made here. The focus needs to be on what's best for our students and keep that focus. But I think it's good to have the information, but I would feel more comfortable if we had a broader perspective of people responding to it.
Thank you. Wise advice, right? Anyone else want to share on the school climate, or we can open it up to more general reflections? Yeah, right over here.
We didn't really focus on the school climate, so this is more my own personal opinion. But as a minority and as a parent of minority students, I think it's very important. That's one reason why I was asking Adam about their data yesterday as they were presenting about Shelby County. If we don't break it down, how do we know what our minority students feel? Because they're often unheard already. And we can say, oh, this looks great if we're just looking at it and not breaking down the minority students. And that's one of the things that I truly appreciate about the climate survey, is because as an advocate for the minorities in my building, I can go back and say, yes, you say this, but when you look at our data according to these populations, it's not the same feel that our predominantly white students have. So I think that's very important in leveling the playing field across our districts, because let's face it, our institutions are predominantly white, with the exception of some pockets. And if we're going to level the playing field, we have to consider the feelings and opinions of everyone in our schools.
Love that. Thank you. Yeah, I was hearing from a number of different tables that different use cases that were coming up around how the data from that survey has been extremely helpful in driving better practices in the school building. So I think we're sort of, what I'm hearing is we're probably affirming that that measure still feels really valuable to include. Unless anybody here would like to argue otherwise, then maybe we can kind of move on to the second topic that Jennifer had proposed, which is the one around school identification. Yeah, oh, Trevor's ready. You don't even need to, yeah, go for it.
I just have a quick question. So that would be a state requirement, though, to do the survey. So that would keep 3 different levels.
So the state would require the school climate, or you're doing school identification?
The survey.
The survey would be, oh, thank you. So it would be a, oh, this is really bad one. It would be, the state would require that every school administer that survey, and then they would use that information in their federal accountability.
Okay,
the
so-
system that they use to satisfy their federal accountability
Gotcha.
system.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Uh,
I'm gonna switch.
thank
That was a little. It's a little harsh. It's a little harsh. Yeah. Oh, wait, over here. Yes. Can you grab him?
I know it's adding up to what we have already mentioned, but it's another layer of complexity regarding the quality of school climate and safety. Please keep it so that students who are multilingual speakers can continue sharing their stories and their experiences throughout the school. Kentucky is one of the states that received the most refugees in the entire United States. Those kiddos who come to our schools many times, they come not able to speak English, obviously. And when they have to share their experiences and their stories through tools like these ones, it is not easy for a person who does not speak the first language or the predominant language in the society. It is very difficult for them to share that. One of the best examples that I can share with you all that pertains to this specific council is when the commissioner tour, the listening tour was done a couple of years ago. The fact that one session was done in Spanish alone, it opened up for amazing conversations by a lot of individuals in the state of Kentucky that brought up stories that this council was not privy to. Because once again, in trying to speak the language predominant in that specific environment, there are things that are going to be filtered always. However, when you provide that access and opportunity to tools like this in the languages that those people speak, and I'm going to include this here as well, American Sign Language, for our individuals who are deaf in Kentucky, you get to learn things that maybe you have never heard before. So please keep it so that these tools can continue being provided in languages other than English, not just for our multilingual learner students, but also for the individuals who are part of the learning community, of the school communities, who are multilinguals themselves.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm really hearing that this is the one measure in the system that really brings student voice into our system, and that feels extremely valuable. Yeah, thank you. You want to jump in?
At our table, we talked about several different things, but I know a concern was brought up about the ranking system and how legislators, I guess, are very focused on looking at that data and holding their schools and teachers and things like that accountable to that. And parents are proud when schools in their district do well, and that makes the legislators in some cases feel very good about the decisions that they've made, especially if their citizens are happy with their schools. And so we talked about how do we still let those districts and schools shine without that high stakes ranking system, as it were. And so we talked about, like, I guess, like the commissioner spoke on yesterday, with the local level being able to brag, so to speak, on certain aspects that the schools are doing well. That would still sort of be a statewide focus as well, just like we do PBIS in the schools, positive behavior supports. We could do some sort of like positive assessment support system to not only look at your really high ranking schools, but also the schools that don't necessarily make the paper for high test scores, who may be doing some super awesome things, even though they may be a TSI school. So we talked about that. Then we also talked about how are we differentiating between like science and social studies and writing. So if science has to be reported at the federal level and at all levels, and so that has to be sort of a uniform assessment at all levels, how are we making social studies and writing different if we're not giving more autonomy to that? Not that we're not, but if we did not give more autonomy to how we're assessing science and social studies, because I know when I did, when this whole United We Learn started and I completed the survey, what I wrote is that kids are more than a test score. And so if I leave here, I want to know that kids are more than a test score. And so I just feel very much like I want there to be some ownership, or would like there to be some ownership in that writing and that social studies assessment. Then, okay, you get to pick a social studies and writing assessment or a performance assessment, that we still dictate what you do. I would love for it to be more like a project base where the kids get to decide and pick what they want to do, rather than that assessment being dictated, because we're not really moving anywhere. If we've done that, how have we changed? Not really. We get a choice, but it's still the same thing.
To kind of build on what she said about the color system, it looks like a lot of the data from the like school administrator and district administrator groups, or a lot of them are concerned about if we take all the competition away, then there's not going to be that motivation to succeed. Or if we set the bar too low, like just meets requirements, then none of the schools are going to want to. So it seems like they're kind of seeing like a blue or a green is like a positive reinforcement almost. So if we remove that kind of positive reinforcement from schools that are high performing, then to sell this whole concept to them, we need to replace it with some other kind of positive reinforcement that Gretchen said might be a more equitable form of positive reinforcement, because we can spotlight high performing and low performing schools for great things they're doing. So I think if we're going to sell this not just to district administrators, but the state legislature, then we need to have some kind of replacement reinforcement for schools to do. You know?
And we like the idea of that replacement being within the local accountability. How local accountability be made visible so that can satisfy.
Yeah, so I just want to, I'm going to come over this way. I see some hands. Just to sort of reinforce, this table is really bringing up this theme of, if we're going to sort of strip down the federal identification to the bare minimum, what are the ways in which we can create positive incentives to really celebrate the other schools? Oh yeah, we got another mic, go for it.
So seeing as how we're talking about student voice, I figured I might as well say something, being I think the only student still actively in public schools here, right? So I think it was you that said like these surveys, the accountability surveys were students' main voice, or like the vector of student voice. But in my experience, and I assume most other students' experiences, I can't really speak for everybody, but I'm gonna say with a lot of confidence that most students really just don't care about these surveys. And they don't see them as a way to express their voice. They see them as just some like burden that they have, like just another thing they have to do, like that their principal has put in front of them and said they have to do.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, even if they answer honestly, which a lot of them just sit there and click through. I know, like, our principal has even said that if you're gonna click through, make sure to click good. That was right. That was what he said. He went on the announcements and he said, yeah, we know some of y'all are gonna click through, so just make sure you give us a good score.
Yeah.
And then even if they do answer honestly, I can't, like, I'm sure y'all are better, but our administration is just gonna cherry pick out the information that they want. Like, they're just gonna ignore any of the negative feedback as long as it still has an overwhelming, like, even a small minority of it, like even the small majority of it being positive data, they're gonna say, oh, it's not a problem then. The majority said that it's fine.
Yeah.
And like the majority is either not affected by the issue, the problem, or is just gonna click through and then reflect positive data in a way that doesn't really end up helping anybody. And then they'll put this data on a slide and give it to us during our that social emotional learning advisory time, and then they'll have us click through and look at it and force discussion that nobody participates in unless it's like a really tiny class. And I've had a class like that, and it was pretty nice because we actually could have discussion, but then that discussion didn't go anywhere because the teacher will either just not fill out the slide because it's like the teacher's supposed to fill it out, and then counselors and administration are supposed to look at it, but either the teacher just doesn't fill it out because they're too busy being like actively participating in that discussion, which is good, but then that information and data doesn't actually get anywhere.
Yeah.
Like it just kind of stays in the classroom instead of going where it needs to go. And then even if they do fill it out, it's not like they're gonna do anything with it. Like they just kind of look at it and say, okay, and then nothing changes.
Yeah, I love that comment. Thank you so much for sharing that. And you're bringing up, I'm hearing a couple really important issues that you're surfacing here. Surveys can be like something that's really easy to manipulate. And we've talked a lot about gaming the system and how do we make sure that the measures that we're picking are not highly, I mean, I hate to hear that you were getting feedback, like give us good scores, right? Like that's something that's pretty easy to manipulate. So something to think about as we consider the types of measures that we want to include. The other thing that I hear coming up in your excellent comments too around implementation. So what kinds of supports do schools need to make sure that they're using that data and actually doing something with that, right? So it's not just a box check, a compliance action, but that they're using that data to really change and continuously improve the school building. So implementation supports feel like an important point as well. Does that comment bring up any reflections, or does anyone else want to react to that? Yep, Sarah, you want to jump in?
I can see it that way in some environments, and I can also see it from a parent perspective. I have seen this survey used as a lever to welcome in students and parents to have conversations where I don't otherwise know where they would have fit in. So I think, that just speaks to the implementation. I think where, varying school by school, I've personally just happened to experience a chance where this survey in particular was a lever to invite parents and students to the table and have that broad representation to have conversations grounded in that data, and then plan proactively for solutions that they then held themselves accountable for to report back to that coalition to see if they were being effective in the changes that they were striving for. So just a counter to that in a way that it could be used very productively. I just happen to have experienced personally as a parent.
Thank you. Oh, Jim and I'll come to Gretchen.
Well, to build on that, in terms of thinking about how this is used, that's going to determine, the benefit of these kinds of surveys. And so what Sarah said, and I've heard some superintendents talk about, that the process that we are exchanging information with our communities is really important here. And when we think about local community-based accountability, that could be a required component or an assurance that we put in place. And then part of that, then to your point, as a student, then those results then are informing what we do in our local community, and impacting that local community-based accountability, as opposed to some arbitrary rating, then which then leads to that kind of corruption that can occur, where we're saying, oh well, give us high ratings on this survey, and so it's all about the use and the function. And so thinking about how local accountability can build trust between the schools and the community, the schools and our policymakers, it's so important how we use that data. And so I'm just planting the seed that could be part of the process, part of the assurances for local accountability that districts must practice, so that it informs their work. To your point, Sarah, that as a parent, that was valuable to you.
Can I just one clarifying question? Are you going as far as to maybe put on the table the idea that the climate survey isn't in the federal system, it is in the local system, or just that there are assurances in the local system that districts need to be using the data from the school climate survey? I'm just curious, like, where the decision point lies.
Well, I don't know that I personally feel that strongly one way or the other of where. I just want to make sure that that data is used effectively to inform what we do. And then I think if it's used effectively to inform what we do, then that's going to build more trust with our stakeholders. I could be persuaded either way in terms of that. I think my point is, if it's used that way, then I think it's less corruptible than if it's used, for some kind of rating purposes, is my argument. So I would be fine personally either place, as long as the purpose is clear and it would inform, what we do, as opposed to, some compliance piece that goes into a rating.
Great. I know he wants to. I think you want to react, and then I'll come to you.
I honestly, listening to both of these perspectives, I think there's a lot of validity in both. But one thing that we talked about, especially at this table, because I raised a similar concern, Raider, that I know when I was doing surveys, if I didn't care, I went pretty positive. If I did, though, I was quite honest with how I felt. And so maybe looking at those negative results more, and maybe a better indicator of how students actually feel. But we made a point is, right now, the reason that people are encouraged to do well on those is because it's such a high stakes issue, and maybe making that less so could really be a good indicator of where we're actually at and give more positive benefits to the survey. So I think that might be just something to think about with that.
Great. So I'm hearing a shift being proposed by this table. So be thinking about this, that because the great comment over here, surveys can be highly corruptible, maybe that's something we want to move. We still want everyone in the state to take it, but maybe we're moving it out of a federal system potentially. Okay, so that's one idea.
I'm just making a few connections here from where we ended yesterday. And Jim, some of your comments about the difference between what you cause people to do because you have the authority to make them do it versus leading them to do something, which is moving things. And it's no secret that at CIE, we are fascinated with systems change, and no secret that we think there are habits that lead to changing systems, and they are not the current habits of most education systems. And so I would just offer that, we are in the weeds right now of trying to make decisions about adjustments to structures, which is a very important thing. And none of us should imagine that changing the structures alone will change the culture of schooling. And so as much as we should take care to figure out what signals these structural changes send, it's also really critical that we think about how we communicate about them, which things we do first, which things we do second, which things we do third, what time is taken, and what supports are provided for those things such that local leaders don't do what our system has kind of taught them to do, which is to receive them as a thing with which they need to demonstrate compliance, which leads to goofy things like being on the PA system at your school, Raider, and saying, you know, if you're going to just check it, hit the nice ones. Like, that's a crazy thing for a school leader to say to their students about a climate survey. But that's exactly what happens when you change these structures with a set of intentions, but you don't deal with the human change factors that are required. So I know that state agencies are in many ways policy and practice oriented entities, but how you do your work in a state agency or how you do your work as a local education leader is totally up to you. And so I just want to put out there, like, I think there's a real challenge for us in thinking about how will we support the implementation of any of these things such that we do something to actually change the behaviors.
Susan's got a comment back here. Yeah.
So we had a conversation at this table about the color rating system. And the question was posed, they would be interested to see the differences in opinion in districts that are performing high versus districts that are performing low. And the question was, or we kind of discussed that the people at the top are probably wanting to keep things the same and the people at the bottom don't like the color system. And so we said that the people at the top want to keep it because they're winning, right? And it kind of speaks to Robert's point yesterday when he gave reports about districts that he has spoken to that like the competition and want to keep things the same. But that led us to a question of, okay, but who is actually winning? Is it the district that's winning, or is it the students that are winning? And if it's the district that's winning, it should be the students that are winning. And if we want the students to win, then we would want as many students to win as possible, and not just the students in our own districts. And so that was just kind of where our discussion took us, especially with underlying issues that we know that are affecting student outcomes that maybe are out of their control as well. So.
Great, thank you. I know we're probably getting close on time. I want to make sure that we've really hit on this color rating issue. Did any other tables have any feedback on this idea of reducing the federal footprint to identifying just those minimum 3 categories? Did you have any thoughts on this sort of proposal for this other category that was proposed as sort of meets requirements? Any other terminology that people wanted to maybe throw out for consideration? Edna?
We talked about the doing, and I don't want to use the word minimum because that's exactly what we talked about. When we use that term minimum, it sends a message. And I think we really need to think hard about the message we are sending. And I hope there's a marketing person in the room who can say it in a way that is really what we want to happen. We want to limit how much time is spent on reporting and free up resources and other things so that we can spend our time teaching children or students. And somehow we need to send that message, because when we say, oh, we're going to bring the federal reporting down to minimum, it sends it's that, oh, so we don't have to do this anymore? But we do have to do it. It's just what we're reporting that's changing.
Yeah.
And I definitely agree with this table about when you make somebody do, and what Gretchen was saying, when you make somebody do something, they're going to find a way to make themselves look good.
Yeah.
I've been in so many accountability situations at the university level where people just play the system. And so we got to figure out a way to get back to that trust and letting the people in the local communities do what's best for their students, I think. And the more we can take, more that we can send that message that we trust you and we know you're going to do the best you can for your students. And yes, we do have to do some reporting, but we want to give you more space to do what's right for your kids.
Yep, absolutely. We'll come right here.
I think the trust is a huge issue. As a former back, one of the biggest issues I've had with our accountability system and testing is that pretty much so we start off with ACT and CTE, EOP, the old COSA, end of February, beginning of March, and our poor juniors are tested pretty much so until the end of the school year. If you're a school that's on a semester-based calendar, your AP kids have a shortened window of learning because of how much testing is done. So it's an equitable education because those in the fall semester get more days of instruction. So when you take into consideration that there are some tests like College Board AP exams are set in stone, everybody in the United States takes the same test at the same time. I would like to see more flexibility at the local level, given to the local level, so that when we're doing these CTE EOPs, schools that may be on a semester, if they have finished up that program in the fall, those students can take that CTE EOP then. By the time we have gone through ACT, CTE, EOP, all the other acronyms out there, and they get to KSA testing, we've got kids who are done. And that's just our regular ed kids. We're not talking about our special ed services kids who have all these 504s and IEPs, and their testing windows are even longer. It's a travesty of how much testing these kids are in and how much instructional time they are losing, all for the sake of high stakes testing.
A tiny implication of what you said when we discussed this as a group that might be good to consider in the room too, which is if we are talking about moving or at least making there an option for there to be locally administered social studies and writing performance assessments in lieu of state exams in those areas, might we also consider some flexibility about timing? Right. And I think this is a question for the technical folks of like, how much variability can we allow in some local performance assessments while still making sure that they yield data that is meaningful? I understand that we're not trying to get those to the same level of comparability rigor as like a federally required thing, but you know, how comparable is enough and how much variability could be allowed such that there could be some flexibility in timing was the question.
Yeah. All right, I've been told I need to wrap. I was about to say, but I heard Travis had his hand up. So Travis,
Yeah.
you're going to get the last comment
I
here.
have a clarifying question,
yes,
and then I may have a comment. So
Okay.
I'm gonna, like, I want to reserve part of my time for the possible question. Clarifying question is, what decision are we being asked right now? And that is, are we being asked specifically about the survey? I heard Jennifer say earlier, I heard her talk about growth as being a possible replacement for that, or transition readiness being a possible replacement for that. So I heard her talk about three different things, because right now we have the school climate, quality of school climate survey, and we have transition readiness at the high school. So I just want clarity around what the question, either we are being asked or we're getting ready to be asked.
Yeah, so what the federal law requires for elementary and middle is that you include your academic proficiency scores on math and English language arts. Another academic indicator, which we had heard pretty strongly, student growth was the indicator that was rising up. So if we use student growth for that, you have to use English language proficiency, and then you need one other school quality and student success indicator. So we could use the survey for that, and that would be elementary and middle. At the high school level, it's proficiency in math and English language arts, English language proficiency, and then graduation rates. So there's one other school quality and student success, which is where we are using the post-secondary readiness, the transition measure. So if we use the survey in the high school as well, then that isn't the bare minimum, which is what we had heard from folks an interest in, but we're also hearing that there is an interest in including that because it is a measure that people value. So that was just a little bit of a decision point we were kind of pressure testing around. If we decided not to use the survey at all and to move it, as maybe Jim has proposed a possible way to think about this out of the federal system, then we'd be okay at the high school level, but we'd have to come up with another measure for the elementary and middle school level. So there are some decision points to think about within that. Does that help?
It does.
Yeah.
So are we going to be asked that question?
Well, I think that's the question, right? Yeah, I think part of this is like really wanting to understand the value of the school climate survey.
Right.
Because if we feel really strongly about that, which I think we heard, where do we want it to sit in the system maybe is the next question. And if we decide it's not in the federal system, then we have to have another conversation about what we would want for elementary and middle in order to meet the federal requirement. Oh, no comment, Travis. You were supposed to give us a good comment. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
We haven't had a conversation about that. So I guess, are we going to have a conversation about that? Or are we reserving the decision around the survey first?
I think we can absolutely have the conversation about the post-secondary readiness. I think it sounds like that feels really meaningful. I would love to hear your feedback or comments about that particular indicator, and I think that would be an important input to help us. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you asked. I just want to note that you asked.
I want to tee you up there perfectly.
So I think my experience, right, with the post-secondary or transition readiness, whatever we're calling it today, seems to be a huge conversation. When we've talked about our local accountability system, and I've had stakeholders in the room, that always comes up, right? I mean, that's what communities want for their students, is when they leave to be ready. So it seems very natural to me that is potentially at least a requirement for a local accountability system, that there's some measure that is defined locally around what that is for our students. We've identified that for Allen County, and I would tell you, as we work through it, it's very similar to what the state already has in the system, right? We want our students to be career ready, either industry certifications or having those apprenticeship opportunities, workplace experience, right? Where they can legitimately answer the question, what are they going to do when they get out of high school, right? They can answer that question because we've given them the right experiences at the secondary level to help them know that, to be able to answer that question. And then if the answer to that question is that they're going on to some type of post-secondary training, they legitimately have had the experiences that prepare them for that, right? If it's college, 4-year degree, then we have equipped them with the knowledge base to be successful, as that's been determined either through dual credit being awarded to the student, or the ACT. No matter what that is, I have a different opinion about ACT. We could talk about another time, but.
Yeah. Yeah, please. Yeah.
And thinking about that also, I'm wondering if that could also be a place to work in. When we think about transition readiness at every level, we think about for 5th grade, 8th grade, or wherever the transition is, that we have districts across the state who are building performance assessment systems around defenses of learning and their portraits. And most of the local accountability dashboards that have been written report upon that, both numbers and quality. And even some districts have board policy that successful defense is a grad requirement. So I'm wondering if it becomes local, if the measure also could be, one of the measures could be a defense of learning, supporting the competencies of their local, the portrait of a learner that their local community has decided upon. And we have 133 districts out of 171 who are building toward that themselves without even being asked to do that. So that is a large majority that we can maybe consider in that overall formula.
Mm-hmm. So am I hearing, I want to make sure, I want to repeat back because I want to make sure I heard this right, and I may not have. What you're proposing, one possibility could be to take the transition readiness out of the federal system, make it required part of the local system, but also extend it down into the other transition points in the system from elementary to middle to high. That's a possibility. Okay. All right. Well, we were supposed to get to clarity. Jennifer's going to kill me. This is great. Yeah, one more.
It's
Jump
bad.
in.
Now the microphone's at this table and we won't let it go. I know, right? No, I haven't had it yet. But in our conversation, it was really interesting. So first it was brought up, if the feds are who are issuing the grant, then are they asking us to push on the federal system? And we're not, really. So that was one thing. So then that made me think, do we need to more? And so I talked with someone who will remain nameless unless you really like the idea, and then I can share it. But I'll take the blame if you think it's bad, but I think it's really good. One thing that we're allowed to do now that might be worth considering is, so the requirement is that we assess to the depth and breadth of the standards. So might we be honest about the fact that I don't think there is any way anyone is teaching all of those standards to the depth and breadth of their intention. No way. So might we consider lessening or prioritizing standards or combining standards to competencies? Let's go to maybe a higher, I don't know the answer right there, but if there are less to assess, then perhaps the type of assessment needed could start to look more like the kind of assessment that might then help to lead to the kinds of day-to-day learning experiences that we want. That just, I didn't think of that. I wish I had. I wish I could claim that as my own, but I didn't, unless you don't like it, remember. But that is just a really good thought, I think.
Thank you for sharing that. You did get some applause behind you.
Well,
so.
then it was Lillian. See how modest I am. I mean, like, I'll give credit.
All right. Well, I feel like there's so many meaty things that I think we probably just need to wrap this session, unfortunately. Is that correct? And we'll find other ways to dig in later if there's time. Is that?
We do have the Mentimeter.
Yeah. Okay. Mentimeter. Let's do it.
So how comfortable are you in terms of understanding what we're considering for federal accountability? This is your sliding bar again. I will get out of the way. All right, everybody good? All right, we'll move to the next question. How comfortable are you with further developing these components on federal accountability as part of a proposal? How comfortable are you with further developing these components on federal accountability as part of a proposal? When we talk about a proposal, we're talking about what is going to go to the board for their general consideration and then ultimately to the legislators for their consideration. So we're talking about moving from prototype 4.0 to a model framework.
If it's gonna go forward, right? We don't have any of these to a level of detail where they're like ready to implement. So anything would need further development. You want components of this to be further developed and then included. Which components do we need to know?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
All components?
Do we want all of the components we've talked about today to be further developed? That's the question.
Being included in the plan.
Okay. I'm sorry. Further developed for the purposes of being included in a plan, right? We're in this like very itchy moment of this work where we've generated and evaluated a number of individual ideas. And we're about to start considering what combination of them do we actually want to develop into some sort of proposal to go forward. So next step is like get to a clear framework of a combination of ideas, probably also some sequencing of those ideas, right? And so the question is like, of the things we just discussed for the last however much time, I was in a time warp. It was 10 years, but also it was like an hour and a half. In that amount of time that we were just talking about these things, are there ideas here that you feel like, yeah, we should further develop them so they could be included in what becomes a proposal eventually? It's very like, yeah, do you want to shout it out?
Don't consider these further?
Yeah.
Like what is our alternative? Because what I don't want is the KUWL Council agrees that we need to further develop these components. And it's like or what? What else could we agree to?
What you could agree to is to not include them.
To not include federal components in our accountability system?
To not make these changes. We're considering a set of specific changes. And you can be like, actually, I don't want to make any changes to these components.
I'm not sure we're clear on the changes. Like, I think it would help if it said, this is it.
Yeah.
This is what you're agreeing to. This is another option. I think we're all kind of getting, and maybe I'm hearing some yes, but I think we're getting confused what we're agreeing to.
Well, and Travis, what you said, it's that we're asking about a number of things at the same time. Right. So one thing being asked about is the school quality survey. There's not a good way for you to answer that in the way the question's provided. That's just true. Yeah. So this is asking about, there's been a set of proposed changes to federal accountability that we've been discussing. This is asking you holistically, do you want that group of ideas to be further developed so that they might be included in some plan? So that group of ideas is right. But do you want to just list out, like, again, what are the components that are in here, just as a reminder to the room? Is it yes, include survey, not include survey? Is it?
Right. So in your packet of the federal accountability, you saw those data points. So we asked questions around those specific components around I would need that. The inclusion of the survey. So you saw those reactions in the data. We talked about that this morning. We talked about the fact that there's reducing to that minimum part. Right now we have a piece in there about the federal reporting to the basic minimum of your what's needed. That piece. We also have then the transition readiness. That has not been a conversation. I brought that up so that you would know, in very transparent, that it is not the basic minimum of federal accountability. And I see Dr. Fletcher on. So, Dr. Fletcher, would you like to add?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I think that would, in the comments section, would be very appropriate. Like, okay, this is the what we're proposing as far as the base requirements. Are there pieces or parts that you think should be also included? But there should be a comment section. What do you need to know more? So maybe in that comment section, be like, okay, I really feel like transition readiness should be a part of federal accountability part. So maybe you add that into those comments. Or I really feel like the survey should be included, or I feel like the survey should be used in other areas that we just presented, or it's put into local accountability somehow. So I think that the open comments would be a good spot to say where your concerns are. I mean, are you comfortable with moving forward with minimal requirements, yes or no? And if you're not, and then say these are things that I would like to see added. I think that would be a good way to handle that question.
So we could also take a break and we could just tune the survey so it asks you those questions directly.
Could do that too.
Sorry, we were just thinking about that. You can't see that because we were on the side talking about it. But the question is, go to federal minimums. I like it, I don't. The implication of that is if you go to federal minimums, school climate survey goes away and transition data goes away, correct? Or at least they have to be considered if you're going to do that.
So,
So it would be,
If we just went federal minimums, what would go away?
if we went with federal minimums at the high school level, that there would be a consideration of whether to include the transition readiness or the climate survey.
So we'd have to
at the high
choose.
school.
Yep.
Yes. Mhm.
And at elementary, we would just remove the climate survey.
Well, if we remove the climate survey from elementary, we would have to have another indicator,
Mhm.
and that could be our science assessments.
Uh-huh. So let's take a break. We're going to create a survey that asks you those distinct questions, okay? So that you can respond to them in little component parts. Yep. Thank you.
10-minute break. And then we'll come back and have the chart paper. Thanks, everyone. 10-minute break.
All right, y'all, let's come back together. And we're coming back. It's totally happening. We're coming back together. We're coming back together. You had some chocolate. You're feeling spry. All right, so in talking with the facilitators at our spontaneous break, it feels to us like this last session in particular was like a little too fast and furious with a complicated set of intertwined decisions. So while we could just disaggregate and ask specific questions, we actually think you probably just need a little bit more discussion. So our idea is to put two tables together so that we can make sure there's a person at each table who could answer some sort of detailed questions about how this might work so that you can have some real consideration at your tables. And then you can use the chart paper that was magically brought to you by elves during the break to write down your idea of what you would like to see happen in terms of combination of ideas. Or if your table doesn't have agreement, write down the two ideas that you think ought to be considered. All of this again heading toward, and again, I just want to acknowledge, like, this is such a tricky spot in our process, right? We have been in a generative mode together of creating like different ideas that we think might have value and moving us toward our moonshot together as a group. We have been testing those ideas with various people in various places. There's been study of some of those ideas. There's been some technical study of those ideas, and there's been the big survey data that we have in front of us as part of that study, all trying to move us to a place that is the opposite of generative, which is decisive, which is just very difficult. It's difficult when being asked a single question, but we're not being asked a single question. We're being asked a very complicated set of related questions. So I just want to acknowledge, like, there is a extreme, I at least feel, maybe you don't feel, I feel extreme discomfort with the level of uncertainty about what comes next. And the goal here is, at the end of the day, we don't know exactly what we want, but I just want to relieve the anxiety that you might be feeling of like, oh my God, am I making a decision right now? Is this survey result going to be the reason we either have a school climate survey or not? Like, it's not quite that high stakes right now. Okay, the goal is by the end of today, we feel like we have learned enough, shared enough, been listened to enough that the department and its partners can go off and create the next step of something that's clearer. So I was saying the word proposal before, others have been saying the word framework before, but essentially what we mean is these ideas have to be considered in combination in some way. Some thought about phases of implementation has to be considered in some way. Us co-creating all of that in detail is probably not feasible. I think we're experiencing a little bit of what that would feel like if we tried to do that all together here right now. So the goal we have in mind for the end of today is, do you feel comfortable that you've understood enough, been heard enough that someone could take a next step forward toward a proposal, which would be some specific combination of ideas with some idea about phases and sequencing, some ideas about necessary capacity building and support, so that we can evaluate that, which again is not like, oh man, we've nailed it, we've arrived, get your t-shirt, we're done. It's not that, okay, but it is a meaningful, important, and difficult next step. So I just want you to keep that in mind, that that's where we're trying to get to today, is just, have we understood enough and been heard enough that a small group could try and advance this between now and the next time we talk about it. There's going to be a virtual meeting sometime in November. Does that feel right? Okay, so with that in mind, Getting in groups at tables, I just want to restate, and Jennifer, by all means, please correct me if I say anything wrong right now. Okay. To be discussed at your tables for the purposes of getting something on chart paper that you feel pretty good about, please consider the following. In the high school grades, we could choose to use the climate survey or the transition measures, or we could decide to use both. Right now, the climate survey is a very small item. It's like 4% of what happens there. The transitions is much larger. It's 20% of what's there. But the point is, in the federal system, we have the ability to decide what we do with those components. And so when it was suggested we want to go to federal minimums, what that would mean is we remove at least one of those, right? Well, we can only remove one. If we wanted to go fully to federal minimums, we would have to remove one of those. We might be like, oh, I want to reduce things. That's why I said that thing about federal minimum, but actually I value both those things. We should keep them both. Cool, that's great. Or not. But that's one thing to be discussed at your tables is for high school, would you like to see, oh, I don't know who that was. I'm not coughing, I just want to be clear. Would you like to see the climate survey stay in high school? Would you like to see the transition measures stay in high school? Or would you like to only see one or the other of those stay? That's the question, so discuss that. Second thing to be discussed at the elementary level, if we choose not to keep the climate survey, it must be replaced with something else. So the reason to do that would be like, man, that climate survey is so junky. I just don't want it there at all. I want something else there. In which case we'd have to figure out, oh my gosh, what is the something else? An easy substitution would be we have science tests that already occur. They're already federally required. Oh no, that goes to the other area. Yeah, but not in the, right. We could decide to do that instead. Science could go in that spot. So you could be like, I don't like climate survey. I really like science. I would like to make a switch is one thing you could suggest. Or you could be like, man, I love that climate survey. I don't know why we're ever talking about getting rid of that thing. That thing's awesome. And you could leave that there. Or you could say, be like, hey, I totally don't like climate survey. And I have this other idea about a thing that I would like to find out if it would satisfy the requirements of there. That's the elementary conversation to be had. Conversation number 2. Conversation number 3 at your tables is, hey, what about this color coding ranking business? What would you like to do about that? Do you want to keep the color codes? Do you want to get rid of the color codes? If we get rid of the color codes, what label would you like to give to the not federally identified categories? If you were just choosing, what would you do?
Please. Just one clarification on that, or just one point I want to make about that discussion is that if we stay with the 3 that are federally required, the CSI, TSI, ATSI, then what that does, we cut it at 5%. That's the federal definition of comprehensive support and improvement. What that means then, if there's no other designation above that, if there's no federal classification, that means that 6%, that the schools that are at 6% all the way up to the highest performing schools are in the same category. So there's no designation on that. So if that's what we're trying to do. So when you're thinking about the implementation of that. Right. Yes.
And also, these
Go ahead.
decisions will
I don't know.
impact the weights of what you all use, right? To calculate.
So
It might.
Yeah. So we're talking about general direction right now. We're staying at that high level. Yeah. Yeah. In that federal requirement. Yeah.
So one last thing real quick. I know you're ready to discuss. Understanding like what that would mean, that like 95% of schools would all be ranked in the same category. You might want to identify of the other things we've talked about, what would you want to make sure happens paired with that, right? Like I want you to be open to relate things in this conversation to previous conversations. Like at my table today, you all had a great conversation about, I feel great about losing those designations if the local accountability is included, right? So if there are components that you're like, man, I like this, but only if this other thing happens, write that on your chart paper. That's really important for us to understand. Okay? Let's try like 20 minutes and then we'll see where we're at. Thank you.
Sharing out. We'll forgive the lettuce in everybody's teeth as they're sharing out.
I'm so glad we had the opportunity for really deep discussion, that we were able to take the time to process together and learn from one another. I know we found clarity at our table. I'm sure other tables made progress as well. So where should we start? I think we've got a couple of actual written proposals on this side of the room. So maybe we start with somebody who's able to speak to what's on the wall over here. Is that Delaney?
Okay, so we're over here. We talked about a few different things, exploring kind of what this may look like from the federal standpoint, how that might restructure some of the components in the domains on the state piece. So one of the things we talked about was moving the climate survey to the state system. So instead of it being the school quality and student success component within that federal requirement, moving it to a state level to try to make it more meaningful for schools, communities, for students. Thinking about like fidelity of implementation, like what is the value add around those surveys? How can it drive that improvement on making decisions when it comes to local accountability? This might be a good way to do that instead of just a reporting piece at the federal level. The next thing we talked about was creating a new federal transition ready indicator that spans the entire system. What I mean by that is elementary, middle, and high. So right now, the state level system, if you look at the domains, you have community connections and transition readiness. I'm sorry, post-secondary readiness. So what we said is, well, what if you take post-secondary readiness and community connections and put that into the vibrant learning experience domain? One big assumption around that is a lot of your post-secondary readiness indicators, there's 10, CTE, work-based learning, dual credit perhaps. You would imagine, or you would think that vibrant learning, it should be baked into the cake of those experiences. So if that's the case, why not have post-secondary readiness and community connections in vibrant learning? And you have to have community to get to more vibrant learning experiences. So we talked about that. If you do that, looking at transition readiness, going into federal accountability for this school quality and student success. That way you could have elementary, middle, and high attending to that federal piece on transition ready. What that looks like, you know, we talked about maybe attendance, behavior, course grades, on-track indicators. You know, we'd have to figure out kind of what that indicator is or what the metrics are for that. And then lastly, there's something on the back. I just want to make sure. Yeah, so the VLE, like you've got a more expanded menu of options, essentially. Also adding in things like military. And then I think the last thing, is the community connection. So moving not just post-secondary readiness, but having community connections go along with that. So that was kind of our discussion.
Thank you, Delaney. Appreciate that. In reflecting on what we heard Dr. Fletcher say at the end of the day yesterday about maintaining a federal system and state supports for local systems, what I think I'm hearing from your group is potentially some of those requirements on local systems might be you have to have this school climate readiness, this school climate survey. You need to have this VLE domain. Here are the ways in which it should be measured. So a sort of a state influence over the minimum requirements for those local systems and having transition readiness prioritized at every level in the federal system. Thank you very much. We have another group that has a proposal on the wall that I think where there is some alignment, maybe some points of difference, and it'd be great to hear where you agree and where you disagree with the other group's proposal rather than just presenting it as if it's new.
I know it's a challenge for you there.
Yeah, so we do have a lot of alignment actually, and I think that one of the changes that we would recommend is especially we thought about how the school climate survey and like how that is created and how that could actually be potentially adjusted to make it more meaningful, potentially with recommending revising some of that to align with United We Learn vision within that climate, and so that would kind of align with the the VLE indicator, and so we think that makes it more meaningful. Excuse me. And then also talking about actually studying how basically studying the validity or the fidelity of that, if you're going to use that, is how students are answering that survey, if it's being if it's being given at certain times after they've already been tested to death, or it's like, how are we actually presenting this so that we get the best quality of that data, so that the students are actually able to share their experiences, because as Alfonso mentioned, that's a really important part of student voice, and we definitely think that that's an important part of the component, is to keep that in there. So one of the things we didn't get to the discussion about transition ready indicators. However, I'm in complete agreement that I think that's really good, and I think our discussions over the last 2 days would lean exactly with what this group has said. One of the things we talked about was about the color rating system, and just how that it's like coming up with a potential change of that. So I come from somebody mentioned PBIS earlier, and the tiered intervention approach. I thought that's something that I brought up and proposed, is more of focusing not on the ranking of schools or in districts, but actually the idea of what the districts and schools and their inputs through the reporting, how it targets the interventions that the state is able to provide. So everyone is provided the interventions at tier 1. They're all provided good policy. They're all provided good guidance. They're all provided guidance documents. They're all provided those HQIRs and all those things that are at that tier 1. If they have certain inputs from the reporting system, then they might receive just a tier 2 interventions, which may be specific coaching or mentoring and professional learning opportunities and those kind of things that are really targeted. And then if you go further up that pyramid, tier 3 interventions might look like something that we already provide through like OCS with our educational recovery leaders, but it could be even more robust interventions. So it's not ranking the schools, it's saying, hey, your proficiency at this is really tier 3, so you're going to get this intervention to help you with that specifically. And then one of the things that we mentioned is the instead of ranking schools, is like really focusing on the successes of schools, and so those schools that are, and so it would really require a systematic focus on lifting up schools that are performing very well, and it could be performing well in certain areas. They might be be requiring those interventions for their proficiency at some things, but they might have really high climate and culture survey data that needs to be elevated. And I think that's a way to kind of still, if you lose the color system, because we mentioned the color system, some districts and schools are using that as a marketing tool. They highlight that to set themselves apart from other districts, and I think that's one way to ensure that we are kind of replacing that, is saying, hey, the state is going to be doing a robust push on highlighting high performing areas, especially around VLE.
Thank you. Yeah, I think brilliant. I love how you're sort of mirroring the supports and interventions that we offer at the school level with what the state is offering for its schools that it serves. I think that is a really helpful contribution. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to cut you off. In the interest of time, I am going to move here to Susan's group. I'm just going to put this up here. I don't know. No, you probably can't see it. Karen and KUWL, I'll have to hold it. Okay, quickly, we, I think, came to an agreement at our table that we would like to keep the school climate survey in the federal system for all 3 levels with some considerations. The timing of it. So because it happens at the end of the year, there's not a lot to do with it
to have an effect for kids in their present situation. So we are proposing that we could possibly take that survey earlier in the year, once the school year starts, get feedback, and use that data to make some informed decisions to make a difference for kids in their in the climate of the school. Also, that there could be, I think Jim brought up earlier, that in the local accountability system, there could be some requirement for that implementation and how it's used. So it would be a part of the federal system that it is given and reported, but the implementation part of it could possibly come through the local system. We also had lots of discussion about the high school transition readiness piece. We think it could happen in two ways, or an either or, that it could be a required component of the local system. We all agreed at our table that transition readiness in Kentucky has made a big difference in our high schools, and it's really what our communities want from us when we ask them, what do we want students to know, be able to do, and be like when they leave us? They answer all of the questions about that readiness. So either being a part of the local system in that same way, or keeping it in the federal. So we had some discussion and different discussions about that. One of them had to do with ACT and considering not giving that to every student, but giving it as an opportunity for those students, just like we do all the other dual credit AP industry search. Those are all opportunities and choices and aren't just given to all kids. So that's a consideration. We also had some discussion around moving toward performance-based reading and math assessments in future phases, and an idea about to further reduce that federal accountability, as a discussion we had as a whole group earlier about consideration of prioritization of standards, so that we can decrease the testing footprint as well based upon priority standards or academic competencies. Lastly, rating, we talked about maybe using the words no designation. We didn't talk a lot about those, but the labels that have to be there, and then no designation instead of meets requirements.
Thank you, Susan. Karen, I just want to get a time check. Do we have time for another table or two to share out?
So let me ask everyone, is everybody okay if we go until 12:30? I know we said 12 o'clock, but I'm seeing some nods. If you have to leave, I understand you have to leave, but we'd really like to get through reporting as well. So maybe if we do one more and then we go on to reporting.
Right. Yep.
And we'll get through that one pretty quick.
Sounds good. Do we have another table volunteer to share in reaction to the ideas we've already heard, or putting a new idea on the table that we haven't yet heard? Yep.
If you want to. I just, in terms of what's distinct, as with this group in the back corner back here, as you might imagine, because Rita was at our table, we had a lot of conversation about the gaming of the survey. And is there anything we could do to try and make it less appealing to game? And that led us to kind of a particular thing, which was don't include the climate survey in the federal reporting. Do require that everybody do a high quality climate and safety measure in their local accountability. Provide the state survey as one way that they could do that, and allow them to build some other thing or use or purchase some other thing if it can be demonstrated to be like reliable. Which, if you don't know how to build a survey, you can build one that's very unreliable and biased. So trying to ensure that that doesn't happen, which we hoped would make it less a thing you want to game. And then there was agreement to keep the transitions readiness, but a conversation about transitions readiness is a weird word that doesn't make sense. And in schools, it's still called college and career readiness. So maybe the measure actually should be called college and career readiness, because that's actually what we're talking about. And that, like many others, there was a desire to have that, which is already kind of an inclusive list of things, become even more inclusive. So like we talked about, ASVAB is not there currently. I know you guys talked about military over there too. So either like a one-time thing about that or creating like an ongoing process by which that would be revisited periodically and expanded as new measures emerge for college and career readiness. Keep the climate survey K through 8. I think we didn't have a good idea about what else you would replace it with. So there have been some other discussions about that, and we didn't weigh in on the ideas that were shared for other things you might do, like bringing down some of those career readiness things into K8. We didn't talk about that as an option. We like the color coding change and removing the designations there. And like many of you talked about, what else would need to be done to make that be okay? Because there are those kind of blue ribbon folks who are going to be bothered by this. And so thinking about what could be done in other components of the system to make that be okay. Anything else, group? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Gretchen. Appreciate that. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Jennifer Stafford now, who will take us into reporting. Thank you.
Sure. So, and we're running low on time, but so we're not going to go into table discussions around reporting. But what we've got in the 4.0 was a transition from the state report card to include more localized information and the ability to have contributions from our schools and our districts into a statewide system. We're in a different place than we were when the 4.0 was developed, because we're in a space now that has more local reporting, more of a local accountability system. So just within a few minutes here, we want to, because I'm going to turn it over to Gretchen to provide some direction. We're going to move forward after today, but let's have just a conversation together around what you think that the state's role, the state school report card should provide that would help the schools and districts tell their story, that is transparent, is meaningful, useful to our communities. Is that where we want to go now in light of the local accountability systems and the reporting that could happen around that? And I would open it up to John and Lillian for additional questions around reporting. And they're looking at each other. Now, okay, so I think I've captured it there. So 4.0 had us to develop a statewide report card that could include local accountability, local pieces. Where do we stand on that? What are your reactions to this local piece within the state school report card? Clarifying question is, if we're talking about not having a state like color coding system and those things, I'm imagining when you say state report card that that's like a sort of dashboard type situation where there's reporting about a number of different measures that are included there. Is that what you're describing as in a state report card? There'd be like the federal stuff and it rolls up in the way that it does, and that's cool. We know that. But these like other measures we're talking about, like a place for local accountability, it would be that there's a place for that to go that's in some sort of dashboard. Not that that is combined in some way with other things. It just is reported as a component within a report card. Very good. Lillian? Okay, so yes, there is a packet on reporting within that. And so you can look at that and see what the current state and what the future state is. In the back of that reporting packet.
Yeah, I was just going to make one comment too as you're reviewing this and thinking about it. And Jim here, I'm going to summon some great thinking that he was sharing earlier with his table. Knowing that there's such high interest in this focus on local accountability, and the things we were getting excited about was the fact that we were seeing these rich dashboards that were showing us, how communities were improving, and they were talking about the data with their community. What also might be some of the things that we would, what was the word you used to describe it, Jim? Like you were kind of like, what are the requirements or expectations that we would want to see, assurances that we would want to see all districts doing? And some of that you had offered up were like, I think everybody should be able to present their data on at least a number of things in a way, whether it's a bar chart or a line chart, but that shows growth and that they can communicate about that with their constituents. Yeah. So that might be another frame as you're thinking about this.
Okay. Okay, great.
We were talking yesterday and today. We worry a little bit about, in the reporting phase, some redundancy that could happen after a district designs a local accountability system, and they have all the components that are in the assurances that Jim talked about, let's say. But then, and I've been the school report card person where you have to input all the stuff on the backside. I've also been the person who does consolidated monitoring visits where you have to upload all the stuff that really you're just giving back to KDE what they provided to you. So in an organized way, and I think it would be similar, but so I would just say, I think we have to be careful about the reporting. I think we need to have a space for local accountability, but not have them submit it in a different way that they've already put on their local accountability dashboard. So even just some space with a link that says, here's our local accountability, instead of saying everybody's got to report it the same way. I think we just have to be careful because of just other things that we've done to add work to things that don't have to add work.
So that's a good point. That's a good point. So, again, we're in a different space than we were even a couple of weeks ago. So with the emphasis on local reporting, local accountability, do we want to continue with even having the option of having a local piece on that school report card? Because if the emphasis is going to be on the local accountability, then linking to that from the school report card, maybe that's the local piece within the school report card is the link to your local. Okay, let's take the Mentimeter and let's see. Sure. Yeah.
So as I talk to superintendents about this, one of the things that comes up is, the variability and capacity on these kinds of things. And so one idea that that's been thought about was we have a contract for the school report card, right? And so could, as part of that contract moving forward, if we move toward this local accountability component, include the technical support framework for the technology to put that in. So it's customizable, but there's a uniform technology platform to support that across the state, as opposed to everybody's just having to figure out what they're doing, and then it might not look the same. So I'm just kind of contrasting that. I agree that we don't want to create unnecessary work, but at the same time, I worry about districts having the capacity to do that and to build something like that. And could that be a part of what the state provides as well? So just an idea.
I'm juggling both of those as well, and I couldn't speak to a leader like Travis in Allen County's experience, but it seems to me from supporting districts through their L3 process as an example, the way in which they're reporting their local accountability system is just as thought out as something that their community wants in the method by which they're doing that. I think that's a really critical point. I think we saw that really well in the Shelby County example yesterday. Their community specifically wanted narrative paired with data. Whereas if the state were to dictate in any way what that reporting looked like on the report card, I would hate to detract from something in the reporting a specific community wanted. I did just want to lift up something that we are seeing as a trend. Regardless, the linking has me intrigued, Jennifer, because our districts who have a dashboard that is public facing, they have just chosen to place that now under their publicly reported reading and math scores on their home pages. That's where you would go to find those as they live now. So I think the linking to from the school report card would probably get a lot of traction because it pairs well with what folks are already choosing to do.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Donnie.
So I want to highlight that it seems like there's at least two big use cases for reporting. One is to spur a meaningful conversation with your community about what you're trying to do and where you're trying to go and how they can support that. And the other one that seemed to emerge from yesterday is actually to support greater networking between districts that are working on similar stuff. And so I think when we're thinking about the nature of the report and how we do it, it has to serve both of those functions. And so that I think the implication for that is maybe in support of what Jim is saying in terms of there needs to be some way of like seeing those similarities so that you can make those meaningful connections, or a place to have the conversation about who should be connected to whom. And for that, and maybe that you don't need a lot of similarity, but you need then space for connecting a conversation and be like, oh, what do you mean by this thing in your reporting, and how do we then, is that similar to my thing, and does that mean we should collaborate more? And there's going to need to be some sense making on the part of the community too, to understand like what does all this mean. So there's a lot of like the platform is the platform, but the conversation around the platform is at least as important as whatever tool we're creating.
And I think when also, just another note is that when we get to reporting, that it's important to have disaggregated data so that we have the transparency and the pieces around our different student demographic groups to be reported publicly.
I'll make
John?
this quick. Really, I had a third use case on top of the two I think Donnie highlighted really well. One thing Andre and I have been talking a bit about on and off is if we're going to be having reporting of the local pieces up to the state, then the third use case I think is how do you use those pieces for some kind of reciprocal relationship with the state so that local districts can identify where do they need the most support, what are those metrics telling them, and then the state can help identify how can we target that support to you. So I'd add that one on top.
Good. Thank you. Thank you.
And I keep this quick too. I wanted to add to what Jim said was earlier, this idea that technical support, can be provided. And I think that can be both from districts already implementing a particular solution in an environment, but then also really talking about sort of the behind the scenes stuff, the data governance, the architecture, the engineering kind of components. And the state could do that too, kind of like point out systems that are in use that are really valuable, but also then all the stuff that people internally do in order to make sure that that works seamlessly and gets updated seamlessly over time as well. And that then can support, the vertical integration up for the state, makes that pipeline easier. So that also is like good data practices within the state that get supported that way.
You ready to go to the data?
Yes, unless there's any other comments around reporting that anybody has. No other comments? Okay. So let's go, Susan, to the Mentimeter around the, I thought we had one on reporting.
Yeah, but we have the data first from the survey data.
And let's just jump right to the Mentimeter because we don't want, I think we have pretty good thoughts around that local piece. So let's just jump right to the.
Okay.
So on reporting. Okay, so looking at the results of the Mentimeter, I think we have some good agreement and some familiarity with your comfort level to move forward. 3.7, we had very similar from yesterday. And then the next one. Okay, so that's the piece. So I'm turning it now to. Yeah.
So this question is still about just reporting, which is if you understand what we're talking about reporting, as we move forward to a specific set of combined ideas in some sort of framework, do you want these ideas about reporting to be part of that? Do you want this, like, are you comfortable with the way we're talking about reporting being what happens? Or at least what's considered in the next proposal. This is, I'm sorry, my language is so iffy when I'm saying these things to you. It's just that I don't want to say like, do you want this reporting in the future? Because it's not that definitive. It's like, do you want this to be further developed as part of the framework that comes back to you?
Well, a comment from earlier that like the alternative is
We don't change reporting.
we don't change reporting. Yeah.
Which honestly, in this case, doesn't really make much sense because if you're
It-
changing these components
yeah,
in the
it
way we're
just-
talking
it
about, there's
doesn't-
no way to not change reporting.
Yeah, it just doesn't feel like a
Right.
real question.
Yeah.
Did we
So
need this
maybe-
question? I think
Yeah.
that's what we're asking. Should we
Let's move
forward?
on. Let's
move on.
move. Awesome. Let's move on. I keep going. Oh. Yeah, so let's hear from Jim and then we'll go to the very last question. All right, so now it's you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first I want to thank you all for hanging with us. I mean, this is hard work. It's tough work. But what's so gratifying to me is that as I hear us processing it together, there's so many common threads of what can be. You know, when Commissioner Fletcher started, he talked about kind of the vision, the why, that, you know, that we're doing this. And when I think about us trying to figure out how to, you know, start landing on an overview of what a model framework will include, I think it's good to remind ourselves, what is that why? And so first and foremost, and Chairman Tipton, you know, it referred to this, is that I think and when we talk to people, we've got to remember to always bring it back to this. So first and foremost, it's what's best for students. We want them to be agents of their own learning, engaged in relevant, authentic learning opportunities. And even I've seen some verbiage about joyful learning opportunities even, and thinking about schools to be that way, and that honors their talent, skills, and aspirations, right? So that's primary. But one of the other things I'm hearing as a purpose that I think we've got to hold on, and we have to talk to people about this as well, is that this builds trust between schools and their communities, between schools and our policymakers, between schools and our partners in this work, right? And when I think about what this system could be, it needs to be a truth-telling, trust-building mechanism that brings transparency for all there, right? So think about that as a system that builds trust with people. And that includes our students, that includes our parents and families, that includes our employers and community members, and it includes our policymakers, including those that set the policy for our states. And then I thought about this thing, and Trevor reminds me of this, it inspires collaboration. And I think that's really important, collaboration among schools and districts, and inspires healthy competition. You know, and sometimes in the past, our systems inspired unhealthy competition. I'll give you this quick story. When I was superintendent, we were doing pretty well in our district, and one of our neighboring districts they were doing really well. And I saw the superintendent. I said, "Hey, you know what? We ought to get our staffs together and collaborate and learn and share with each other, we could really, help one another do great things. And he said, well, that'll be fine as long as we beat y'all. And I remember walking away. I was so saddened by that, because that's what the system inspires right now. Our primary motive is to beat y'all instead of help every child become the best version of themselves. And so what we're talking about is a system that would do that. And so where are we finding agreement on this? What I'm hearing is a federal minimum. And, we struggle with, okay, well, what does that actually mean, right? But we're starting to get some things around, how do we meet that federal requirements and, and have the survey as a part of that, post-secondary readiness or transition readiness or college and career readiness, whatever we call it. That's the big end in mind. That's the big prize, right? So, but sometimes I think we can think about it. It's federal minimum and local, and there's ways to thread that so that it brings consistency and coherence and alignment throughout. And then this excitement, I think, around some kind of a through course assessment that provides formative and summative data and growth, a growth measure, not comparing one group of kids to the group of kids that came before them, but comparing how they did 1 year to the next, comparing those kids to themselves. And so that seems to be some pretty exciting momentum or traction. And to go away from, a state summative assessment, but then a parallel system that districts are purchasing to provide that formative diagnostic data to inform instruction, but having one system that does that and brings that to the table, more efficient and more valuable. And then thinking about this local and what that could be, thinking about this menu of options that districts can choose from and innovate from, but that there's required quality assurances, there's required components. Like I heard people talking about, well, yes, everyone's got to teach social studies, but what does that look like in each district? Well, maybe the options are you can do your local, performance competency-based assessments to demonstrate the evidence of your kids' performance on social studies or writing or science, or the state can provide you a system for doing that for those that aren't quite ready for that. So we're not making somebody do one way or the other. And then I've heard some really interesting ideas about some inputs. We know outputs are important, but there's inputs that we know are good, and that connection to the community, that collaboration with the community, those systems that make sure that their voices are part of that could be part of those assurances. And just like we just talked about how that survey data could be more authentic for our students if they know it's going to be useful and to impact their experience in their schools. And that could be a part of the system. So I think there's a lot of places that we're starting to find agreement. And so as we're thinking about your final votes, and are we in a place where we can start building this framework? It's not at the granular level. I mean, the reticence that some people have is the devil's always in the details, right? And so there's still a lot of work to do on this, but are we finding a place where we can start building that framework because we have these components kind of saying, yes, there's agreement to move forward. And I think I'm hearing some traction in that, and that's very exciting. And so the last thing that I'll say before I pass the mic back is I've been dreaming about this for a long time. I was thinking just recently, I started as an educator in Kentucky at the beginning of CARA, and we were on a really exciting path. And we probably bit off more than we could chew to start. And I remember those first performance assessments, and they were, it was a little shaky, to say the least. And then, we tried some things, and then we abandoned that. We were in the process of going through some iterations of what we were doing then. And then along comes No Child Left Behind, and it blew Kentucky up. I mean, it really just took what we were doing, and it destroyed us at that time. And then we were kind of reeling like, okay, now we've got to meet this federal mandate of No Child Left Behind. And we kept trying to figure out how to do that and do it the right way, but we kept running the same problems. And then we ran into a recession, and that caused problems. Then we ran into a pandemic, and that caused lots of problems. But as I was talking to this, I can't remember, it might have been you, Ray, that it also, though, that experience provided an awakening that we can do better for our kids, and that we can't sit here and accept that this is how it's got to be. And that's what's so exciting to me, because there's a lot of us that have been dreaming for something better for our kids for a long time. And just, I just want you to know how proud and honored I am to just be doing this work with you. So thank you for that. But no, we still have a long way to go. And it can't be just the department, just the commissioner, just the Kentucky Board of Education. We've got to stay engaged in this, and we've got to help communicate this. Think of the challenges that we've had putting our mind around this. And those people that haven't had this experience with us, we've got to find ways to communicate this to them a way that brings them along. And so there's still a lot of work to do, but we can do it. And so thank you again. And is it you? All right.
Thank you.
Wait, you want to do a cheer? Let's do something. All right.
All right. So this is really like a process note, right? So we talk all the time about these habits, inclusion and empathy and co-creation and reciprocity. And in complicated processes like this, maintaining reciprocity is quite challenging. And I feel like we are sitting in a moment of challenging reciprocity ourselves. And I've also heard in the room some challenges about what are we doing to make sure we are still inclusive enough of voices outside this room. We had some gaps in our survey data. Students obviously not well represented. Families not super well represented. Businesses not super well represented. They were included, but not in large numbers. So we're in this like sort of cruxy, angsty moment of how do we stay in meaningful reciprocity as we move forward, because we have to do something to get to forward direction, some consensus about forward direction. So I tried to say some of this earlier, but I'm going to restate it, which is that, we have, I would say I can at least sort of like smell some emerging consensus, if that makes sense, right? It's a little abstract still, but you did a great job of naming like a number of things where we are starting to sort of seem like we have some agreement about individual components. And there's a big leap to be taken soon about like, okay, but if we were to implement those components that we seem to smell consensus about, in what order might we do that? And in what sort of progression in terms of phases might we do that? And when we consider putting these three together in the same place at the same time, are there some consequences of that actually we haven't properly dealt with? So your conversation about the devil's in the details, I feel like the devil's just like running around in here right now, So the question is really, and this is a Mentimeter question because, again, we want to be in reciprocity with you about this process. Okay, so this is a serious question, which is, are you comfortable? Like, do you feel like you have been heard enough? Have you learned enough? Have you shared enough that KDE and its partners could use everything we've heard and learned from you to come back to you with a more specific framework? And I'm saying framework, not proposal, and I'm certainly not saying policy, right? But a framework in which we combine some set of ideas that we smell we have consensus around. We consider and propose some sort of sequence of those ideas. We consider phases of implementation of those ideas. still staying at a relatively high level, like the devil's still going to run around after we have this framework to you. I'm just going to be honest, okay? But we get like one step closer in combining, sequencing, thinking about phases of these things so that you have that more concrete thing to consider. The question is, are you comfortable with us doing that? Have we heard you enough that you're comfortable with us doing that? Once we have that, we still have work to do. We have to engage with it, respond to it ourselves. As we heard this afternoon, when we do get into the details, there's some like stuff to ferret out that's hard. So there's more of that work to be done. There's maybe some more feedback to gather from others who are not in the room today to help deal with some gaps that were in our survey data. That we are not promising you we know exactly how we're going to do all those things right now. All we're saying is we want to bring you a draft of something that's closer for your consideration in November. And then we'll figure out together how do we get from there to whatever our next step is. So that's the question is, are you comfortable with KD and its partners creating this framework for you to consider in November? Yeah, you just said that's the highest score we've had all day. That makes me have some tingles, you guys, because that means we are working together in reciprocity, and that feels really good. Yeah, now it's time for a cheer, Jim says, yeah. So there is one more question for you, which is just, it's in your Mentimeter, it's not on the screen because it's going to be one that collects data, but like, hey, as you know that we're doing this, you know, is there anything in particular that's important to you about how we go forward so that you get this thing in November and you can move forward with it? Is there anything you want us to know? Like, I don't know, Afonso, you might be like, man, I really want to hear from students. Can we make sure there's a plan to hear from students, right? So whatever it is that is important to you about what we kind of deal with as we go forward, there's just a space for you to indicate some of that. So the second Mentimeter question asks you those things. All right. With that, Karen, do you want to bring us home?
I will.
Okay.
Okay, so just a couple things. We have, let's see, feedback sessions to schedule in November. So that's what Gretchen is just mentioning. So this framework that we intend to put together, we would like to bring everyone back together virtually in November and get some of your feedback on that. So not another prototype, but a framework, everything we've been talking about for these 2 days. So by show of hands, is everybody good with a virtual session in November? If you are good with that, can I see a show of hands on that? Am I going to do it during school?
We're going to, so on the survey, the reflection surveys, there's going to be a section where you can determine like what time.
Yeah, and it may be that we have more than one so that everybody will have some flexible times. Yes, Alfonso? I'm sorry? Oh, yeah, so we hope to have some flexible times. We may have a time during the day and a time during the evening so that we can get everybody's voice in there. Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. So we'll plan to move forward with that, and that'll probably be the week of November 18th. So just kind of looking at that week is what we'll get something out to you as soon as possible on that. Homework. There are some technical notes that our partners have put together, and we would like everyone to read that before we come back into November. They are going to be put out in your member drive. So the KUWL Council member drive in Google is where those will live. So for everybody to read those and then come into our November discussion prepared. Susan is going to send out travel vouchers, anything else that you need. If you need anything for reimbursements or that, y'all know, contact Susan. She'll get you hooked up on that. You can leave your badges and everything else on the table. We'll collect all that from you at the end. I think that's it. Anything else? Thank you all so very much. Okay. Yeah. So as always, we have a short survey here for just your reflections of the day and your availability for that November. Oh, the November already is in there? Apparently we've already come up with some times. So go ahead and fill that out if you will, and that'll help us to get those dates set up. All right. Thank you all so very much. Please, everybody, be careful going home, and we'll talk to you in November.